What's it like to use a 10-year-old iPhone in 2023? This is the iPhone 5S, a phone that launched all the way back in September 2013. I feel old just saying that. But this phone was a big deal. It marked the switch to 64-bit with the A7 chip, it brought biometrics to the iPhone for the first time with TouchID, and it refined a design that has carried through to the iPhone even today. But what's it like to use this a decade later as we head into 2024? Well, I've been using it for the last week, so let's find out. What's up guys, my name is Jack, I make videos about all things tech, and I'm gonna say it, the 5S is Apple's best design from the early iPhones. You can at me in the comments if you think I'm wrong, that's fine, but I've got a lot of love for the 5 and 5S. They just looked so good for their time, and I think that it laid a lot of groundwork for the iPhone today. So I thought that we could take a bit of a retrospective look back just to see what it's like to use 10 years later. First things first, this phone feels tiny. It looks honestly hilarious next to the 15 Pro Max. It's easy to forget just how massive phones have become in recent years. And heavy, the 5S is just half the weight, just over 100 grams or about 4 ounces. And you know what? It's actually nice to be able to hold a phone easily in one hand, thanks in part to the flat sides. I've always been more of a fan of the iPhone with this sort of more boxier shape. The 5S fits great in the palm, my thumb can reach every corner of the 4-inch display. It's not a struggle like the Pro Max iPhones where you have to try and awkwardly reach over or use reachability. The 5S was a refinement of the iPhone 5, constructed from an aluminium frame, sandwiched by the front display glass and 2 glass cutouts on the back. This is the space grey and I love the matte black look, very slick with the dark tones, although this is like the 100th variation of space grey that Apple's made. It is different every time they do it. The diamond cut chamfered edges break up the monolithic design and they just catch the light, adding a real premium feel to the phone, while also softening the harsh edges as you hold it in the hand. And even after 10 years, this still looks stunning. Everything about it, from the buttons to the speaker grille, just feels so precisely machined. It's by far one of my favourites. But it's hard not to notice how dated it looks in other areas, like the massive forehead and chin above and below the display, the physical home button, which here included the very first Touch ID sensor on the iPhone. It also has a headphone jack, which you'll rarely find on phones today. The lightning port on this was only a year old at the time, and a decade later, that's only now just been changed to USB-C on the 15 series. Plus the mute switch, that's now a customizable action button on the latest Pros. Something that really stands out though, that really makes this feel old, isn't something that I can show you, as it's how something feels, and that is the vibrate. It feels like a tin can rattling around, like listen to the vibrate on the 5S. And then the haptic engine on the 15. It just feels so much more satisfying. It is way more subtle and precise and yet distinctive. And it's used across iOS for all sorts of different feedback. And it's one of the most underrated modern iPhone features. You might say that it's a small thing, but the difference really is night and day. Seeing these two phones from a decade apart next to each other, you can clearly see the influence that the 5S has had on Apple's recent phones. The 5S is like the granddaddy to the 15. Can I say that? Well, I just did. How about performance? What's it like to actually use this phone today? Well, surprisingly, it's not been terrible. It has Apple's A7 chip, their 4th in-house iPhone chip, so still quite early in the Apple silicon journey. Navigating the OS, there is some lag here and there, but it is usable. Opening apps or switching between them, there's definitely a delay as it tries to sort of catch up, and Safari often has to reload pages that you were just looking at with its 1 GB of RAM. The A7 was really important though. It was the first smartphone chip with a 64-bit architecture, allowing it to handle way more data and information than a 32-bit chip, and setting the iPhone up for years to come. All in all, the A7 came with some pretty big performance gains. It was twice as fast at both CPU and GPU tasks than the iPhone 5 before it with the A6. I've been trying it out with some older games and apps from the day, which the phone still handles quite well. Let's see if you recognise any of these. But even these older games, anything with 3D graphics really pushes the chip to the max. The phone gets very warm after just a few minutes of playing. And obviously the 15 crushes it today. The 5S is pretty slow just loading some games. It takes literally minutes for the game to even boot up. And with this older chip, the game lacks the more advanced graphical effects, the better reflections and shadows that we're used to today. Now the 5S originally launched with iOS 7. Today it can't get anything above iOS 12, which means that some apps just won't be compatible. When you go to download them, you'll just be told that you'll need a newer version of iOS. If there is an older version of the app available, then the App Store will try and automatically download that instead. And yeah, trying to navigate and find apps that still work on this today is a bit of a pain. And just to point out, iOS 12.5.7 was released at the start of 2023, so this has been getting some point releases to fix some bugs and exploits, which is pretty good going for a 10-year-old phone. The 4-inch Retina display still holds up well. With an 1136 by 640 resolution, it's not even classed as HD, and yet text and icons still look really sharp and crisp at 326 pixels per inch. But this is a standard LED display, so the contrast ratio suffers quite noticeably. Blacks aren't truly black like on an OLED today, and it can't display proper HDR content. It only goes up to 500 nits of brightness, half that of the 15 Pro Max in typical use, so on-screen content can be a bit harder to see in very bright conditions. Plus the viewing angles here just aren't as good as modern displays. It kind of washes out at the extremes. Going from 120Hz ProMotion back to a 60Hz display, I can really notice the difference. It makes scrolling and moving around the phone feel a lot choppier and slower than it actually is. And as you can see here, the screen does have a bit of a blue haze, but that could just be down to its age. I don't think I could ever fully go back to a screen this small. I've just gotten so used to the 15 Pro Max. It's great for films when traveling and having that massive viewfinder in the camera. I mean, just look how small the keys are on the 5S keyboard. Autocorrect had to help me out quite a bit here. Just to go back to the home button for a sec, the 5S was the first iPhone to have any sort of biometric recognition in the form of TouchID, which kind of changed everything, because before the 5S you'd have to manually enter your PIN or passcode every single time that you wanted to unlock the phone, unless you chose to keep it unlocked for a set time, or you just didn't set a password at all, which apparently a lot of people used to do. TouchID made it way more convenient. The phone just unlocks when you place your finger down on the home button. But I will say, this first-gen sensor is showing its age. It feels a little slow. There is a beat between putting your finger down and the phone actually unlocking. It's not as fast as the later second-gen version. But nonetheless, it removed a lot of the obstacles and annoyances with PIN codes, and it got people to actually lock their phones. I know there's still a lot of love for Touch ID. I personally prefer Face ID. It just feels faster and more seamless, but I don't know, which do you think is better? Let me know in the comments. I did pop in a SIM card and it was able to connect to the mobile network here in the UK. I was surprised that it actually worked. I know that some carriers and networks have just dropped support for some older phones in parts of the world. So yes, the 5S does actually work as a phone in 2023 for now. It came with support for 2G, 3G and 4G, but not as fast as current phones. In a speed test, the 15 Pro Max was around 7 times faster on 4G on the same network, and 36 times faster compared to 5G. The same goes for Wi-Fi, but of course this does depend on your service and speed, but the 5S is limited by its older Wi-Fi standards. So yeah, there's been some pretty big upgrades to connectivity in the last 10 years. Let's talk about the camera, as this is one of the most obvious physical changes to the iPhone over the last few years. The 5S just has a single 8 megapixel eyesight camera, as they called it, on the back, versus the triple camera setup on the 15 Pro Max with a massive 48 megapixel main camera. The 5S camera is barely noticeable. It is a dot. It's like the same size as the flash or the LiDAR sensor on the 15. But it is flush to the body. This was the last iPhone to have a flat camera. Now we have these huge camera bumps on the back, which just keep getting bigger and bigger each year. Here's a few comparison shots. We've got camera A and camera B. Which do you think is the 5S and which the 15 Pro Max? Let me know your honest guesses in the comments. I think it's a lot easier to tell in some of these than others. But well done if you said A is the 5S. These shots make it pretty obvious with how dark the tree is. The 5S doesn't have any sort of fancy post-processing like on modern smartphones. It does have HDR, which can bring back some details in the highlights and shadows, but on a camera and sensor this small, there is only so much that can be done, and often the highlights just blow out completely. In this low light shot, we see way more detail and sharpness from the 15, which captures 24 megapixels from its 48 megapixel camera, and much more noise on the 5S. You can really see it on the glass here in the background, And again, it struggles to capture the full dynamic range of the scene with the sky overexposed at the edge of the frame. But you know what? These photos aren't actually as bad as I thought they were going to be, and they have quite a unique feel to them. In some ways, it's probably because there's so much less post-processing. They don't have that artificial look that you sometimes get from the 15. There's no optical image stabilization either, it's all software based, so you do sometimes end up with a few blurry shots. There's no portrait mode, no Pro RAW. The camera settings page is pretty bare. The camera feels a lot more bare bones than we're used to. But with just the right conditions, you can get some pretty decent photos from this tiny camera. It is definitely still usable. On the video side, this maxes out at 1080p HD at 30 FPS with no HDR video, and again, no stabilization, so things can get shaky as you start to move around. On the front camera, things do get pretty bad. This is just 1.2 megapixels. Our selfies in 2013 definitely suffered, that's for sure. The auto white balance was way off in some of these shots as well. I look like a Smurf here. I'm actually not blue. Oh, and for video, you get just 720p from the front camera. This was pretty much here just for FaceTime. Now this came with a 1560 mAh battery, which on paper sounds pretty tiny compared to the 15 Pro Max with almost 3 times the capacity. But you know what? It's not actually been as bad as I thought. I mean, yeah, gaming and browsing the web or heavy downloads definitely drain this thing pretty quickly, and it does get quite warm. Its smaller screen works in its favour here though, and for a 10-year-old phone, it's doing pretty well. It lasts longer than my 6S. There's no way to check the battery health in settings. That only came to newer iPhones, and I did pick this phone up used to make this video, so I suspect that it might have had a battery replacement at some point in its previous life, considering how well it's managing today. I've been able to get around 3 hours screen on time. With the metal back, this does only have wired charging. Qi Wireless did come a year prior to this in 2012, but the iPhone was a bit late to the party with no support for it for another few years. To me, the 5S is one of the most iconic phones that Apple has ever made. The design has stood the test of time, and with it brought a lot of features that we take for granted today. Can you use a 5S in 2023? I mean, yeah, it works, but you probably shouldn't. You're going to run into a lot of app compatibility problems. A lot of newer apps and games just flat out aren't going to work. And it's classed as vintage, so you only get updates for the most serious exploits. And it's soon to be classed as obsolete with no more patches. But as a backup phone, maybe as a spare when traveling, then sure, its small size and weight actually make it kind of perfect for that. Just check that your network and carrier still support it. Coming back to this has really made me appreciate just how far the tech has come in the last 10 years. And yearly upgrades now are getting smaller and smaller, but over a long period of time, they really add up. Hit like if you want to see another retrospective tech video. It was fun taking a look back. If you ever own the 5S, then let me know what you thought of it in the comments, and subscribe and hit the bell for more tech videos from me. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.